Hi everyone, my name is Geeta. I'm the creative producer of The Capital. Welcome to our digital theatre, and thanks for joining us for Brazen Hussies in Conversation, which we're co-presenting with Melbourne Women in Film Festival, which is currently running online until Feb 24. A bit of housekeeping: if you're having trouble hearing me, we recommend turning the volume up in your Vimeo player, which is the little blue triangle in the bottom right hand corner of your screen. If you just turn that up all the way to the top and then adjust on your own monitor, that should sort you out. So we're all meeting from various locations today, and I'd like to acknowledge the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation, on whose unceded land I'm on today, as well as the lands of the traditional custodians across Australia, wherever you might be joining us from. So today we have a very exciting panel to discuss the incredible documentary Brazen Hussies. I'd like to welcome Catherine Dwyer, the director, Philippa Campi, a producer, Andrea Foxworthy, also a producer, Pat O'Shane, lawyer and activist, as well as Akana Kanai, a researcher in gender and media at Monash University, who will also moderate for us. I'd also like to do a shout out to my colleagues, Eric North and Isabella Radevsky. Eric's in the background doing all the producing behind this. You can't see him, but he's there. And Isabella is moderating the chat. So if you haven't found the chat yet, open up the chat box on your Vimeo player. Isabella can see all the questions that you might be wanting to put into the panelists. Questions might not get answered straight away, but know that they have been seen and they will get circled back to at the end of the conversation. Okay, that's all from me. Welcome, enjoy, and over to you, Akane.
Great. Welcome, everyone. And thanks so much for joining us for this panel. I'm really looking forward to hearing from all these women on not only the film, but also the events that happened that the film documents. Before we proceed, I just wanted to also offer my acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people on whose lands I am located today, and my respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait people, Torres Strait Islander people viewing this, and particularly Pat O'Shane, who is on the panel today. So just to inform you that we do have a few audio issues happening between the panelists, so we might be a little slower, but please bear with us. So the first question I have for everyone is of why you think it's so important to document women's history, particularly a local history. I found myself really struck when watching the film that I was very moved to see all these events, but also I didn't know a lot of the names, and that was really striking for me. So perhaps, Catherine, you could start.
Thanks, Akane, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm currently in Perth, and I'd like to pay my respects to the Noongar people of Western Australia. And in terms of why it's important to document women's history, it's something that I notice is very much lacking in mainstream narratives of Australian history. And you can easily get the sense that perhaps that women don't do anything of historic value. And as you can see from the film, they certainly do, but our stories aren't told. And so I also didn't know any of the women that are in the film until I started researching it. My mother is a second wave feminist of that generation, and she gave me a lot of the feminist values that I have. but I felt like this history was being forgotten. And so I really wanted to go back and find out what happened.
Fantastic. Yeah, I think the research that the film is underpinned by is really notable, and it's just so fascinating to see. Maybe Andrea, you could go next. Why do you think it's really important to document a local women's history?
Yeah, well, I'd say similar to Catherine, just that I found a lot of this history that I wasn't aware of. It was quite exciting to find out about it, and it's like the legacy that has that we have received. So I found it really that I connected to it by thinking, wow, you know, these are all the rights I have because of these people, and I've never been taught this before. So I think it's really important for women to know that, especially, as Catherine says, when you look around and see statues and the books you read at school, it's often men depicted as the real change makers. And so I think it's really important to share this history so that especially young girls can grow up perceiving themselves as people able to create positive change through their actions.
Absolutely. Philippa?
Yeah, I think for me too, it was really about having a sense that I did not know this history through my own education in the Australian school system. But I just distinctly remember Catherine had worked on a film called She's Beautiful When She's Angry, which was an American film about the American women's movement that she worked on for 3 years in New York. And I remember when that screened at the Melbourne Film Festival, just the idea and the sense of seeing that trailer and getting so excited about sort of uncovering that history. And then I hope that we've been able to achieve something similar with Brazen Hussies, that it actually is our own history and our own accents and our own women that is sort of as exciting and compelling as that. And I just remember that sense of, wow, this is a women's history. And then on top of that is, wow, this is the Australian women's history. You know, that's really important. I hope that all of our children actually get to understand that in the system coming forward, that it's just there now for them as a record.
I'm so struck. I was really struck by the similarities that I found with that documentary, She's Beautiful When She's Angry, which also made me feel similarly very angry and just struck by the changes that have been made, and also obviously how far we still need to go. But it is really powerful to see that reflected, I think, in your own setting, as opposed to the States, which is obviously very important, but also, you know, I guess this is why I'm asking this question. So, Pat, what do you think? Why do you think it's important for you to have a local women's history documented?
Well, to fall back on an old Chinese saying, women hold up half the sky. But in fact, there would be no history if we leave out the history of, if we leave out women's history. Through the ages, men have assumed power, and on the whole, they've used it quite irresponsibly. And what I mean by that is they have destroyed other cultures. They have generated war wherever they have been. One in particular that resonates very deeply with me was the bombing of Hiroshima, because I was just a very young child at the end of the Second World War. And I remember troop ships going past our house. I was only a little girl. But apart from that, they've also destroyed the world. What we have, the big question at present is climate change. And I don't know too many women, maybe there are some around, Gina Reinhardt, who have damaged the country significantly and chopped down trees and polluted the atmosphere. I don't know, too many women have been involved in that. We have to tell a different story, and we have to tell it out loud and strong. Right, I am living only a few metres from the shoreline in far north Queensland, and when I was a kid, I could swim up to the Barrier Reef. Nowadays, the Barrier Reef is almost completely destroyed. When I came back here at the beginning of this year, I noticed that so many trees had gone. And in their place, there was development. And most of the development is owned by men, as we know. I noticed that the bird numbers had decreased horrifically. When I was a child, there was any amount of natural ecology, bird life was teeming, snakes, spiders, lizards, fish, they've gone. And that was the work of men. I watched them when I was a kid. I watched them chopping down trees, dynamiting trees. I watched them fishing out the creeks. I watched them chopping down the trees and planting acres and acres and acres of sugarcane, which is a product which uses a lot of poison, which gets run out to the Barrier Reef and destroys the fish life, etc., etc. So if you and I don't tell the history of what we are doing on a daily basis, looking after our families, ensuring that we have childcare facilities, ensuring that we have free public education, then what kind of history gets told? A very damaging history. At present, I'm feeling as if everybody around me, all of the societies, all the communities are crumbling, as if we're carrying a disease and it's just crumbling away like a stale scone or something. It's a very devastating thought that this is what has been happening since I was a very tiny child, when I remember the Second World War. There's a lot more I can say, but I'll wait my turn again.
Well, actually, I wanted to ask, I think it's so useful to be reminded of the massive changes that have happened over the 20th century. And obviously, there's a lot of agitation that happens in the 60s and 70s in many places around the world. So, Pat, I wanted to ask you, how did it feel to be agitating in this space around this time? How young were you when you started having some of these ideas about linking, personal experience to the political?
At what time, sorry? In the present or back in the 70s?
The 1970s.
I've actually been an activist for many, many years. My mother and father were activists. Is that what you wanted me to talk about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry. To back, we meet you, Pat O'Shane, in the documentary in sort of the 1970s. So it would be great to hear about the 1970s. Yeah.
Well, my very earliest recollections of of marching in the streets with my mother was when I had just turned 9. My mother was a member of the Union of Australian Women, and they were then agitating, especially for childcare, for the right to earn your own incomes. After it was immediately after the Second World War, and a lot of women had been brought into the Women's Army. They were responsible for keeping the economy of the country going whilst men went to the battlefields, and many of them, as we know, didn't come back. So they were not going to then just sit in the lounge chair and listen to the radio and listen to so-called women's programs and not get anything out of it. There had been, I was aware of that even as a child, because my mother and my aunts, who were Indigenous, went out to work to earn a living. They didn't leave it to the men folk. And in any event, a lot of men couldn't get jobs because there was nothing there for them. Many came back extremely traumatised. I remember some of the men around my parents. So I had, and I think part of the my political development was having seen those troop ships, troop transports going past my place. And I think the reason that it made such an indelible impression on my mind was that it was the adults around me must have been talking about it at great lengths and being horrified at the bombings that were not terribly far from where we live. And after the war, I remember that there were still bomb tests going on. And I remember the talk being about pollution in our milk, and that horrified me. I had these visions of the fallout from the bombs being eaten up by the cows and being bottled in our milk. That was an image that I had, and I was really very frightened about that. So I knew I had to be an activist, even at that very early age.
There were so many huge monumental changes that were happening sort of globally, leading up to this time. And something that we also see in the documentary is this kind of awareness of, women's liberation happening in the US and the circulation of influential books and all of this. I guess I'm just going to come back to Catherine, Andrea, and Philippa, because I'd like to ask more about how you ended up, researching what was happening at the time, and how did you end up crafting this storyline of what would be featured when there were so many things that were going on. So I guess maybe I'll start with Catherine.
Well, like Philippa said, I was inspired to make this film from my work on She's Beautiful When She's Angry in America. And I just kept thinking, well, I wonder what happened in Australia. So at the Melbourne Film Festival, Women in Film and Television actually organised a panel of local historians and feminists who had been involved in the movement in Australia, and that was a great jumping off point for me. It was, I had these women in the room talking about what happened here, and that's how I started. So with the historian Marilyn Lake was on the panel, and she wrote a history of Australian feminism, which was the sort of first book I read. It was called Getting Equal. And that's where I read about Pat O'Shane writing the famous article in Refractory Girl about, does the women's movement mean anything to Aboriginal women? And a local historian, Jean Taylor, was also on the panel, and she had published a huge memoir of the memoir. Was called Brazen Hussies, which is where we got the name from. It's a great title. And Mel Thornton was also there, who's famously chained herself to the Regatta pub. So that's how I started. And from there, I got a lot of experience in research working on the American films. So I just started deep diving into archives, state libraries, university archives, reading histories. And obviously it was very difficult to eventually shape it into the film that it became, because the movement affected every aspect of women's lives. Everything about women's lives was political. And so there's, so many ways you could break that down. And it's a huge thing to try and tell a story of a whole social movement. But I think what enabled us to bring it all together was those very personal stories of people's personal experiences, especially around women's bodies, which are so policed in this society. So control over women's bodies was a very central kind of part of our focus. You can see that in the single mothers, in people's right to access abortion, and in terms of domestic violence and women's ability to leave abusive relationships. And I guess it was a long journey and it took a long time, but we're very happy with how it turned out.
On a slightly different angle, but following up on that, maybe Andrea and Philippa, I'm curious, there would have been, again, so much to feature, as Catherine has noted. So how did you end up working out, were there kind of challenges in working out what would actually go in and what would have to be cut out of this? I mean, how did you negotiate that?
I can talk it was a difficult.
Maybe Philippa first, then Andrea.
Okay. There was a lot of choices to be made, and with Catherine, Rosie Jones sort of selected stories that represented the breadth of the movement. So kind of, I guess, from women representing the more radical end of the spectrum in the movement and some reformist end of the spectrum in the movement, and everybody in between, just making sure that we had both of those elements covered in order to kind of demonstrate how social change is made on a broader level. There were a lot of hard decisions made, and there were people we wanted to interview definitely who we couldn't. There were, many, many, many more stories to tell, but it was a tough call. But over to you, Andrea, too.
Well, I was just going to say that culling process sort of happened throughout. Like, it happened through the writing process, when Catherine was writing treatments and rewriting, and we were giving feedback on those. And then mainly in the edit suite, I guess, with Catherine and the editor Rosie Jones, who did a fabulous job helping Catherine pull it together into a cohesive story. But another element was, as Pip said, some people were no longer available to speak to. So there were people we really wanted to talk to that we didn't get to film. But others, that it was influenced by, the direction was influenced by whether we had the archival footage to tell a particular story or not. So all of those factors came into play. And there's a lot of decision making along the way, which Catherine knows the pain of very, very directly.
I'm sure that would have been such a challenge. Pat, I'm coming to you now. How did you find the film? We meet you sort of, I guess, kind of about halfway through when significant momentum going at that stage in terms of women's liberation. How did you find the film and the portrayal of the events that were going on? Was there anything there that surprised you in seeing it on film?
I wasn't surprised at anything I saw in the film. I suppose the one thing that did strike me was the lack of Indigenous input. And that's one of the running sores, if I can put it in those terms, that I think the feminist movement in recent years, like since the 70s, has had to contend with. And I have said for many years that many of the non-Indigenous women who participated in it were racist. And I have very good, solid foundation for saying that. In particular, I was angry about the way, at the time, I was not at the time of making this film, at the time that the movement was in full flow, was the way in which so many non-Indigenous women purported to speak on behalf of Indigenous women, and especially those from remote areas, such as in Central Australia. For instance, anthropologists and the like, they always knew better than we did. And that's something that I would not tolerate. And of course, a number of others wouldn't tolerate it. My mother had died by that time, but like people like Kath Walker and any number of women that I can name from around the country. That aspect annoyed me. One of the things, that is the lack of the Indigenous woman's voice. One of the other issues that struck me was that I have always been a person who can look at a situation and say there's something wrong here and there must be some way that we can do better. A lot of the, for instance, when I became head of the Ministry of Aboriginal Affairs, I hired a number of Indigenous women because they would be working within the public service, but they were working on very low income and they had very short tenure. So I set about trying to find a way that would ensure their continued employment, and in the course of that employment, being able to advance up the ladders into secure employment within the public service. I went about doing that by going around and talking to all these male bureaucrats. Remember, I was the only female at the time, and talking to them about taking on a member of my staff. I would have discussed it with her first to ensure that she was happy to enter into this program. And then we would discuss how she was developing. And I just kept doing that until all of the female staff I started with ended up working for other departments. But in the process, they were getting a different education and they were getting secure work. They were never, unless something personal arose, they were never not going to have a job anymore. And they certainly weren't going to be on the job for a few months and then get the flip because they were not permanent members of the public service. So that's what I started doing. And I would ensure that within the staff, everybody, male and female, had their responsibilities or had the same responsibilities, which I kept turning over. So this week, Mary would be the receptionist and John would be doing something else. The following week, John would be the receptionist and Mary would be doing something else. And so kept building up their skills and their ability, really, to do the job. Because the best way to do a job is to do a job. That's very simple, in my view. They didn't have to go to university. I was lucky in that regard, but in fact, many of those women afterwards did go to university, and I considered that to be a major feather in my cap. I had done something real. I hadn't just had them, getting a job for 5 minutes and then see them on the street and have to hang my head in shame because I hadn't been able to ensure that they had a future. It wasn't about me. I've never thought it was about me. I've always thought that I had a responsibility to all those other women out there. And on that point, I thought in the course of the film that I watched, and I noted a number of women, many of whom I knew personally right through that whole period, who seemed to have the idea that it was about them. And a couple of them in particular. And I thought to myself, you've got that wrong, sister, you've got that wrong. I still go through life saying to myself, how can we do this better? At present, up here in Queensland, we've had a lot of racism in respect to Indigenous youth offenders. And there's an issue up here about vigilantism. And vigilantes in this very town that I'm sitting in now carry out nightly patrols and they hunt down young black offenders. Now, that has to change. I went on ABC Radio earlier this week and I stated that the Premier, because she came out with a perfectly ludicrous statement about increasing penalties, talking about how there is a better way to deal with these issues. So it's always been with me. When I was a teacher, I was the same. I think when I was in the playground, it was the same. And when I, took on law, it was the same. So, and it rather surprised or disturbed me that a couple of the women that I have in mind were still talking the way they had been talking, how long ago is it now? 70s, almost 50 years, isn't it? So I thought, the bottom of the energy seems to have dropped out of the movement. Mind you, the whole of our society is in a pretty bad shape. Our economy has gone to pieces. Pandemic aside, there are some very, very bad men who are hold the power in this country. And I think that Trump had a very big influence on those very bad men here in Australia. And it's very hard for us, for women, to grab the attention of the media and to push the issues the way we were able to do once upon a time. I mean, once upon a time, we could expect that the ABC, for instance, would take up issues and really involve everybody in a really in-depth conversation about matters. That's gone. So those were my thoughts at the time. I'm not a genius. I'm not putting myself as, as being the person who has the solution to everything, but I always keep in mind that because I got to where I got to, then I'm home and hosed. And that's the end of the story. It's not the end of the story. I still want to see change for every other woman I know, and for young women in particular. I don't know where young women are going to go today. I mean, just in the last couple of days, I've been hearing about young women going to work in government, for instance, like the office of ministers, and being sexually assaulted right in the seat of power. That is an absolutely shocking incident, or a shocking state of affairs. It's not an incident, it's a culture. And somebody or something has got to stop it. I don't know how many women have spoken out about it. I haven't been reading that in the newspapers. I mean, there are female ministers. In fact, I think the particular incident that I'm referring to occurred in the office of a female minister in the Morrison government. That is an absolute scandal, and they seem to be treating it as if it was ho hum, get over it, or some such, or that they don't believe it. Or Morrison has to run off to Jenny at night, who always puts things right. Well, no, no pay for that, boyo. You shouldn't be in the job.
I think that's such a sort of a timely reminder of things that are going on, even, today, in the last week. Catherine has just said we have a private chat for the panelists, and she just said, well said, because I think it does need to be said. I'm also reminded of, also in the High Court, there were some news broke, I think, last year about sexual harassment and assault in that also seat of power. So we can see that this is something that is really ongoing and precisely hasn't really needs to be addressed. So I'm going to ask a question of everyone, I think following up from Pat's last response, and that is so in the film, one of the big themes that activists recounted was the disappointment from not finding support from people that you would have expected. So men on the left, for Aboriginal women, white women, etc. So I'm wondering how you think this kind of sense of political allyship has moved, or if it hasn't so much in the present time. Maybe Philippa, did you want to go first?
Sure. I think it's true to say that in those days they didn't find support where you might expect they would have. I feel like now the conversation has shifted a bit more in terms of kind of keeping top of mind an idea of including other voices and other perspectives. And I think that that's something perhaps hopefully that feminism has developed, in that it is more cognizant of different perspectives. I think that there seems to be more conversation now about including others, involving others, and ensuring that all voices are being heard under that banner of feminism. So I hope that that has something that's shifted in terms of alliances and just understanding that it's about everybody moving forward together, not just certain groups or certain loud voices. I hope that that's something that's changed since the 70s.
Catherine, what did you think?
I'm just reading the question again. Yeah, I think the lesson in those experiences, and what Sue Bellamy says about the men on the left, that she says you don't necessarily see yourself as others see you, and it's the same with racism, is echoed when Pat comes on screen and says that the white women didn't understand, were racist. They didn't, and there was unconscious racism. And it takes a long time to get over these deeply embedded attitudes, to quote Pat directly from the film. It's very difficult to unpack those, and there is absolutely a bedrock of sexism and racism in our culture, which we continue to have to unpack. But the most important thing is not speaking on behalf of groups of people that you are not a member of. And it's about listening and making sure voices are heard. And the most effective way of spreading understanding is through stories. It's the stories we tell, and making sure that stories are told from different perspectives. I think the thing that really I grew up feeling was missing as somebody who loves to watch movies is how Hollywood movies, how lacking the female characters were. They were obviously created by male writers, and it was just so obvious, and yet men would be oblivious to that. So yeah, it's in the stories that we listen to, and the stories that are allowed to be told and listened to, and that's, I think that's very important. But in terms of allyship, in terms of sharing platforms, I mean, when there's so many urgent issues at stake right now, climate change being the foremost of many of our minds, I think it can be difficult. It's not always easy getting all these voices heard, and I think it's a continual negotiation. But listening is key. Listening to others is the key to allyship, I think.
I agree, and it's so it's interesting as well, because a lot of current talk is about pushing to hear your voice heard, and especially that's a language of social media, right? Having your voice putting your voice out there, but it's more difficult to find easy ways to listen through sort of instant communication and all these other media that we're using more frequently now. Pat, what do you think? Do you think there's been some change in terms of allyship as it's practiced now? Or, I mean, you mentioned in the film you thought that many women hadn't really changed from when, the 70s, where you felt they weren't very good at listening at that point.
Connie, have you addressed me?
Yes, I have. It's a bit confusing because I put it in the chat as well. But I just, sorry.
So you're asking me about a change
about
ally.
Yes.
Well, I'm not really sure about that. I think about it often because it comes up in my everyday life anyway. Not only when I'm acting in a professional way, but generally. I think the alliances have been weakened by the changes in society, or the fact that society, as I see it, is really falling apart. I don't know how we rebuild those alliances. There are a couple of the more prominent women who were interviewed for the film who have been very good at self-promotion. And in the process, it seems to me that they've forgotten who they are. That is, in terms of the rest of us. I mean, the job still has to be done. I still talk to young women about all of us building our alliances and supporting each other in all manner of ways. I think that's been lost to some extent. Maybe it's the fact that I am not moving in the circles where it's still going on, but I don't hear much about it. I don't see much about it. A lot of young women, it seems to me, have been, I think, been have stars in their eyes, and I think, if they align themselves or allow themselves to be promoted as the right-hand person of a powerful man, then they've made it in some way. And I hope they don't go falling down a cliff someday soon, but I fear that that's where they're heading. Do we have any powerful women any longer in our society? I mean, we had people like, what was her name, Reid and others. Whitlam promoted women very to a great extent. I haven't known a politician anywhere ever since who's promoted women and women's issues in the way that he did. Say what you will. and I think I think that the opportunities for younger women to find older women who will be their mentors or guides or supporters are just falling away. I don't know where they are anymore. But that may be because I'm not moving in the right circles. I never did move in the right circles, but I'm far from moving in anything that might be called right circles nowadays. I just can't answer that question really.
I think what's really interesting in your response, Pat, is also that there's a sense of intergenerational allyship. So not just, allyship between, people who might have different class backgrounds or, other kinds of identity differentiation, but also the ability to speak from different historical experiences and connect them as well. So I think maybe I'll come to you, Andrea, for our for our final question, because I'm conscious that we've got about less than 10 minutes. So I'll just, ask, I guess, in terms of, what you've learned from the filmmaking process, what's in the film, but also just more generally any personal reflections. What would you like people to take away from this film or discussion? Is there anything in particular you'd like people to think about, remember? Yeah,
well, I think it was really important for us for people to more generally have a better understanding of this history and to have an appreciation for the work that was done to give women the rights they have now. But also we wanted to show what was done, but also show that there is still a lot of those tasks that people were working on in that era really aren't complete either. But we wanted a sense of optimism about it, that we've seen people join together to take action on certain issues and how much change that can create. So hopefully we've left people inspired to go out and take action on something that they believe in and that they think is unfinished.
Philippa?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think it's really about how what we've seen in the film are a collection of women who've each in their own way taken on action themselves, and they've, on a personal level, an individual level, have contributed to a collective change. And I think it's really something that I was so inspired by. Actually, one of the most beautiful moments, I think, in the film is that footage of Pat with her children, and you can just see that role modelling of those young girls seeing their mum do something incredible, and just showing that way, that, that sort of level of personal commitment to make change on an individual level can literally inspire others and create massive change. So I feel like it's that really has stayed with me from the film, is that each of those women did something out of their comfort zone and have achieved something together.
Thanks, Philippa. Pat, I'd like to hear what you thought. What would you like people to take away from the film?
You throw it to me?
Yes.
Am I next in the queue? Okay. Well, I have always believed that women are powerful, and what we have to do is harness the power that we all have, our collective power. We've done it in the past. I gave you something of the history that I experienced when I was even a young girl, a young child, in fact. And we need to build that up again, especially in this period when it seems to me society's just haywire. I mean, there are terrible things happening in the world, and I just gave a couple of examples. But I think it's possible, in fact, because I think young people are looking for something. After all, we've got the movement by young people against the extinction of the world. I mean, the big efforts have been driven by a very young woman, and school children have been coming out in the droves. So there is that area there. There is that culture there that we can become participants in, and to also take them in other directions. Of course, I believe very strongly that it is the most important pressing issue that we have to confront. But on the way, we shouldn't forget others that are of lesser importance, but no less necessary.
I think, that such it is really important to have hope in what, we all collectively doing, particularly the way in which young people have been mobilising for, in relation to climate and all these other issues. You have to place your hope somewhere in passing the baton, I guess. So, Catherine, I'll come to you finally. I don't think I said this at the beginning as well, but before we go, I just wanted to make sure I said congratulations on the film as well. This was obviously such a labour of love, and so I'd like to hear from you finally, as the writer and director. What would you like people to take away from this?
Well, essentially that that women do make history and have shaped society today, have had a huge influence on where we are today. And that being said, we've still got a long way to go. And so I think for young people to see by example of their elders and from history that they can be participants in changing the world, I hope that they will feel empowered to go out and make the changes that they see are needed today. So it's a continuous practice, and something I learnt from a panelist I did a Q&A with recently. She pointed out that feminism is not an identity, it's a practice. And so we can continually improve upon our practice of feminism. And we can continue to listen to voices, especially ones that don't often get to be heard, and we can help amplify those voices. If we can use any privilege that we might have to amplify the voices of others that don't get heard, then we should try and do that. I think that's a very important part of a feminist practice. And so, I hope people will just go out there and seize the day, and most importantly, to do it together. It takes collective action to make change. You can't do it alone.
Absolutely. I think the film definitely leaves you with a sense of there is so much that we could do, and leaves you a sense of the enormity of what has been done so far as well, which I think really makes you reflect on how some people getting together can really do something, even though, you know, it might feel kind of dispiriting, particularly with the past political culture that we've been living through, to think about change. But it really attests to the fact that so much change has happened in the past half century that wouldn't have even been thinkable before. So I want to thank you again. So thank you to Catherine, Andrea and Philippa for helping to make this film come to life and doing that work of documenting a local women's history. Thank you to Pat for participating in the panel and giving your thoughts on the history as you yourself have lived it and continue to live it. And it's just been such a wonderful discussion. I apologise if things have been a bit slow or a bit glitchy because of my very rudimentary moderator work, but it's been such a pleasure to be able to talk with you all today. So thanks very much, and yeah, I'll hope to see you on the closing night of the festival.
Thanks, Akana. Thank you, Pat.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. It was wonderful joining you.
Thanks.